Hey everyone, welcome to the shop. Come hang out with me as I turn these prefabbed teak boards and some leftover maple into a nice little mid-century modern coffee table. I recently found myself in need of a new coffee table, and when I was deliberating trying to figure out what I wanted to make, I went to my local big box store and I found these prefabbed teak boards that I thought would make a really great top. After I brought them home, I threw together a quick sketch just to figure out the dimensions and write everything down so I wouldn't forget. I do this for every project. I have a few goals for this project. Considering that it's for me, I wanted to spend less than $100 on it. I didn't want to use any of my expensive slabs. And I only wanted to spend about 10 hours putting it together. And most importantly, I wanted to build something that my wife will be happy with. What was most important to her was something round that matched our existing decor. Part of the reason I picked up these boards was because they were on sale for $35 each, making the top only 70 bucks. The maple I'm using for the legs is left over from another project, so that was free. The consumables like the glue and finish come out to about $10. And the Z-clip fasteners to attach the top to the base are only about $1. This gives us a grand total of $81 for the entire build. So all I've done so far is joint these factory edges to make sure they're going to come together really nice and clean for the first glue up. And as you can see, after they're jointed, there is no gap between the panels. Next it was time to glue up the panels. I originally was planning to use epoxy here like a Fixo from Total Boat, because that works a little bit better with teak that's really oily. But in the end I decided to just use regular wood glue. This joint is not going to be under any stress, it's not going to be bearing any of the load of the table, so regular Titebond will work fine here. After the glue was dry, I removed any squeeze out with the chisel. Then gave it a quick sand with 80 grit just to make sure it was relatively smooth. Next it was time to turn this square into a circle. So to do that, I'm using this circle cutting jig that I made out of some scrap plywood. There are a ton of tutorials on YouTube on how to make these, and you can also buy them, so I didn't show myself making one. But basically you attach your router to the jig and put a straight cut bit in your router, and then attach the jig to the exact center of your panel. This provides a kind of pivot point for the router, at which point you plunge cut just about a quarter or maybe even less, like 1/8 of an inch into the wood, and start rotating the jig around. If that didn't make any sense, you can watch me do it here. Periodically I stop the router to vacuum out some of the wood dust just so things don't get clogged. As I'm doing this, I'm just being very careful to make sure that the jig is not lifting up off the piece, and I'm going very slowly since teak is a hard wood and I don't want to overwork this little trim router. After the initial pass, I turn the router off and lower the bit about another 1/8 of an inch and do another pass. I think I did 4 passes total, just so I was about 1/2 inch or so through the material. Half an inch is about enough for a templating bit to write on for your router, but before I did that I wanted to hog out the rest of this scrap wood, so I just very carefully went through with a jigsaw and cut all the edges off. Then I came back with that templating bit on a bigger router to remove the rest of the material. I did a couple of passes just to make sure the cut was clean. Like that, I had a perfect circle. And I didn't want to leave the edge of the table sharp. I think it looks and feels unfinished. So for the top, I did a 1/4 inch round over. And for the bottom, I did a 1/4 inch chamfer. And just like that, the tabletop was done, and it was time to move on to the base. As I said before, I'm using some leftover maple for the base, so here I'm just cutting all of my legs, my stretchers, and my support pieces to their appropriate lengths. And then ripping everything through the table saw so they're the right width. And to give this table a mid-century modern look, I wanted angled legs on it. Now you can get really complicated with angled legs. You can figure out the exact amount of degrees that you want the legs to be, but I don't like doing all that extra work. So I'm going to show you the method I always use for table legs, which is just taking my piece, placing it against a flat surface like the surface of my workbench. I tilt the leg till it's the angle I want, and then with the edge hanging over the lip, I just scribe against that straight line so I know the angle that I want to cut. Then I take it over to the miter saw, and using the laser on the saw, I just find that line that I drew. For this first one, I'm being very careful to make sure that the angle is exactly what I drew. 1 degree can make kind of a big difference for a table leg. So I'm taking my time here, but the other 3 legs will go really quickly. I'll be able to just make the cut. Now the last thing you want is a wobbly table, so for table legs it's really important to make a system where you can have repeatable cuts. So I always do some kind of a stop block for table legs. It gets a little bit more complicated because there's an angle that I just cut into this side. So what I'm doing here is using some painter's tape and CA glue to place a stop block at the exact angle that I just cut into the leg. That way I can place the angled edge that I just cut against the angled stop block, and it'll sit really snugly against that and the fence, and I'll have a really clean, repeatable cut. After that stop block was set up, I cut the same angle into the other end of my 4 legs. And just like that, I had 4 angled legs. Next, I needed to cut that same angle, but in the opposite direction on my stretcher pieces. Since it's the same angle, I didn't need to mark it here, but just to make sure I wasn't messing up and putting the angles in the wrong directions, I laid one of my legs on the stretcher and marked where I was cutting, just so I didn't make a mistake. Then I went back to the miter saw and cut those angles into the stretchers. After all those angles were cut, I laid out the leg assemblies and decided that I wanted to add a taper to the legs. They were looking just a little too blocky and heavy. So here I'm just marking on one of my legs the wood that I want to remove in order to taper the leg. I marked in 1/2 inch from the bottom and 12 inches up the side. Then connected my 2 marks with a straight edge. Then just colored in the area that I was going to remove. Next I grabbed my tapering jig. This, again, there's lots of tutorials on how to make them. I bought this one just to save time, but what I did was lay my leg along the edge of the tapering jig, so just the area that I colored in was exposed, and clamped it down so it wouldn't go anywhere. Then I placed a piece of blue tape along the bottom of the leg so I would know where to place the next one. Then I ran the jig through the table saw, making sure that the blade was high enough to make the cut. And just like that, tapered leg. Off camera, I repeated this with the other 3 legs. Next, it was time to glue up these leg assemblies. So for this, I'm using dominoes. So I started by cutting the mortises. And I wanted to get really even clamping pressure, so I'm using that same trick with the CA glue and painter's tape to glue on the cutoffs from when I cut the angles into the legs to the edges, just so there's a right angle so I can get even clamping pressure. Then it was finally time to glue, so I spread glue on my pieces and my camera died. So I missed the glue up, but I'm sure you've all seen what those look like. After they were dry, I took a chisel and removed my clamping cauls. They worked really well. And next I went over all the edges with a 1/4 inch round over bit. This was just going to be a lot easier before the final assembly. Next, I cut the mortises into the support pieces as well as the leg stretchers. Then it was time for the final glue up. With the final glue up done, it was time to start thinking about how to attach the top to the base. So for this, I'm using these little Z-clips, and the easiest way I've found is to just mortise in a little slot with the domino joiner, and the Z-clip will slide right into that. Then it was finally time for finish. Since this is teak, I decided to use teak oil on both the base and the top. I really like teak oil. You can use it both interior and exterior. You can buff it to a nice shine, and it has no problem soaking into a hardwood like teak. Some exotic hardwoods like teak have a lot of tannins, and not every coating is suitable since they don't penetrate. So teak oil for the win. Lastly, I laser engraved my logo into the bottom, attached the base to the top with those Z-clips, and this table was done. All in all, we hit our goals. This only cost me just over $80 to build. I spent just over 10 hours building it, and my wife is happy with it. But if I'm being honest with you guys, I'm not crazy about this base with this top. So I think in a future build, I will create a new base and switch it out. Thanks for hanging out. We'll see you on the next one.